Okay, let's start with this this whole idea that some would say the battle for the U.S. Senate is being waged in the state of Florida, this battleground state. Is that the way you see it, control of the Senate waged in Florida?
No, I don't. I think Florida is going to be critical in the presidential race because if the president wins Florida, that pretty well does the win for the president because of Florida's huge number of electoral votes. But in the Senate race, I think there are going to be enough other states that will elect some of our colleagues that are already in the Senate that it will not have Florida be the deciding place for the balance of the Senate.
Congressman Connie Mack has said all along if Romney takes Florida, he wins. Are you concerned about the Romney voter drive and the influence it might have on a Senate race?
Well, I think what's going to come out of all of this convention is setting the record straight on the misinformation that came out of last week's convention. For example, you heard over and over a $700 billion cut to Medicare. It was exactly the opposite. It was $700 billion of savings that came from providers like insurance companies, and that extended the life of Medicare almost a decade. So once people start understanding what the truth is, then I think a lot of this teeter-tottering back and forth on what is the direction of the country, what is the direction of Florida, I think that'll then smooth out.
Well, I think a lot of people will be anxious to see that smooth out because as a voter it's difficult to determine what is truth. There seems to be a kernel of truth in both arguments. I want to come back to Medicare in just a moment, but I first want to also ask you about the attack ads that are launched already on Connie Mack. I mean, you have ads that say a promoter for Hooters, history of barroom brawling, road rage, trail of debts, one of the worst attendance records in Florida. When I asked about these, Connie Mack basically kind of brushed it aside and called it nonsense and said, well, Senator Nelson's been a public figure for 40 years. He doesn't have anything good to say about himself, so he's going to come after me. Do you stand by your ads?
Well, understand what the fact checkers have said, that everything in that political ad is true. Take, for example, he has one of the worst voting records attendance this year. That's absolutely true. He doesn't like to show up for work, and yet he continues to take his salary. Now, I don't think that that's what people want in a senator, but they've got to know it. Now, mind you, I'm the recipient of $15 million of attack ads that are all, the fact checkers say, untrue. So the question is, are they going to know what the truth is about me and my opponent? And so that's what's happening.
I want to come back to Medicare now, because you said that Connie Mack voted to end Medicare as we know it, and then he pushes that argument back about the $716 billion move to save health care later, but is still taking $700 billion from the pot to use at a later date. When you look at Medicare, what is your plan to save Medicare and Medicare Advantage?
Well, I've already voted on it, and it was $700 billion of savings that came from providers like hospitals and insurance companies on Medicare Advantage. That savings has extended the life of Medicare almost another decade and allows for the reforms that are going on. And so that's the truth, and we're going to make sure that people understand it.
Social Security, do you believe Social Security is going broke, or do you just think it needs to be fine-tuned a little bit?
Well, we last reformed Social Security in 1983, and it is actuarially sound until the year 2034. So we've got over 2 decades left to fix anything that needs to be done in the future, but my opponent has a plan that he calls his penny plan that takes $1 trillion out of Social Security. I don't think senior citizens want to do that.
So you can honestly look at Florida senior citizens and near seniors and say, you're going to have Medicare, you're going to have Social Security, and nothing's going to get in the way of that.
Well, let's look at what my opponent has voted for in Medicare. a voucher system that does away with the guaranteed benefit. A senior citizen gets a piece of paper called a voucher. They then take that and buy insurance from an insurance company. I don't think senior citizens want the elimination of that guaranteed benefit.
Aside from these ads going back and forth, this race is a bit nasty. You brought up the mentioning of all the money that's going into this. One of the big knocks that Connie Mack keeps throwing out is that Nelson is a lockstep liberal, voting most of the time with Barack Obama, including the Affordable Health Care Act. Do you believe if by chance the Republicans gain control of the Senate, they will repeal health care as we know it, this new law? And will the Senate, if you gain control, make sure it stays intact, no matter who's president?
Well, let me address your first question, which was, how do I vote? If I think that the president's right, I support him. If I think he's wrong, I oppose him. And that's the way I've always done it in my political public service. Now, the health care law, people don't want to repeal it. You go through all the things.
But polls do indicate that a majority of people do want it repealed.
You say, do you like the health care law? They'll answer as you just said. But you say, do you want to repeal it or do you want to fix it? An overwhelming majority want to do that. And when they start finding out what's in it, that they can keep their kid on their policy until age 26, that an insurance company can't cancel them in the middle of their treatment, that you can't refuse somebody insurance because they say you have a pre-existing condition. The fact that now insurance companies have to give 85 cents of your premium dollar into health care. And if they overcharge you, there's $120 million that's going out to Floridians right now in insurance companies overcharging. That's all as a result of the new health care law. You tell them that, do they want to repeal that? Of course they don't.
It comes down to how much are you willing to pay for it too, does it not? I mean, at some point there is an expense involved in all of this.
All right, and so you and I are paying for all the people that don't have health insurance, that can afford it, that end up in the emergency room and don't pay. And the fact that you're bringing those people into the health insurance system in the private marketplace will reduce Floridians' policy premiums per year just under $1,000 a year for a family of four.
Let me give you a chance to respond to the claim that you've raised taxes 150 times. When I pushed Connie Mack on that and I said, fact checkers again say that's not accurate, he backed off a little bit but still said, doesn't really matter. What does it matter if it's 130, 140, 150? You still raise taxes. Can you look at me and look at the folks in Florida and say, not only have I not raised taxes, can you point to areas where you have reduced taxes?
As a matter of fact, if you check those fact checkers, they say that not only have I not done what he said, but that he didn't mention the times that I voted for the tax cuts, most recently earlier this year. And so what you're having is a lot of misinformation that's just simply not true.
Let's talk about Florida employment. Unemployment now 8.8% in the state of Florida, above the national average. Do you see an economic turnaround in the making? The question all week has been, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?
And the short answer to that is yes. And the longer answer is, where were we 4 years ago? In September and October of 2008, we were in a financial meltdown. After Lehman Brothers had gone down, the stock market crashed, the banks were going under, massive job layoffs, they couldn't get credit. Where are we now? For 29 straight months, private sector job growth. It's slow, it's painful, but we're coming out of that abyss that was almost the financial meltdown 4 years ago.
Can you point to a public policy or a plan that you have in place during this past term that has created jobs in the state of Florida?
Yes. TARP, look at the saving of the oil industry, the automobile industry and all the ancillary activities that came on. Look at the stimulus bill. 40% of the stimulus bill were tax cuts. And what about all the projects in Florida, roads and bridges, sewer plants, Everglades restoration that came out of the stimulus bill?
Let me ask you about a name that's going to be mentioned here in this arena, Charlie Crist, a man who was a Republican governor, ran for Senate as an independent, now backing President Barack Obama. Is this a man that you can look to and say, he thinks like I do?
Charlie told me that he has endorsed me, and I'm very grateful for that. Charlie, I understand, is going to speak here at this convention, and I wish Charlie the best. The fact is that he has the way that he runs, and I have the way that I run.
Do you see him entering the race as a gubernatorial candidate, as a Democrat?
I don't know.
That seems to be the speculation everyone's tossing around.
I simply don't know.
You know Alex Sink, the former chief financial officer for the state of Florida, who may also be interested in running as a Democrat. Comes down to Alex Sink, Charlie Crist. Who do you support?
Well, let me cross that bridge when I get there, because there are a lot of others that have announced. Nan Rich, maybe Rod Smith, several other people that are talking about getting into it. Look, I'm concerned with 2012, and you keep your eye on the target and you don't get off.
Let me ask you one other question before I let you go. The tone in Congress, the Gallup poll says that Americans are kind of fed up with Congress in general. Only 10% say they're doing a good job. You're a part of Congress. What do you say when you see a statistic like that?
We're way too partisan, way too ideologically rigid. My whole life has been to reach across the aisle in a bipartisan way to bring people together to build consensus in order to govern. How do you think that I passed in this environment the Restore Act for the Gulf of Mexico with a vote of 76 to 22 in the Senate? Big bipartisan vote. It's by doing exactly that, bringing people together instead of this polarization that is going on in American politics now. And that's what we've got to do to solve this country's problems.
What happens in the Senate, though? I mean, let's say you go back to the Senate and you're in the same situation. What changes that didn't happen over the last 4 years in the Senate?
Well, what happened in the Senate is you got to have somebody there to bring people together, and that's what I did, passing the Restore the Gulf of Mexico Act.
But what about your leader, Harry Reid?
Well, once we get through with this election, I think you will see over half the Senate that is ready to take on the question of the budget and the deficits, and I think you will see that done through a major reform of the tax code. I've already said that publicly, and other Republican senators like Lindsey Graham of South Carolina have said exactly the same thing.
But this argument that the Senate hasn't passed a budget in nearly 4 years now. I know there was a budget resolution, and I know you would have been in favor of it, but it failed. It didn't make it through, but this goes back to 09, 010.
See, you have more misinformation.
Share it with me, correct me.
We passed not only a budget resolution, that's just passing through, that's not signed into law.
Right.
We passed a budget act last year, passed by both houses of Congress, setting the limits of spending in the various federal categories, and signed into law by the president. That's the truth.
So we have a working budget, and you feel good about that?
Well, it's just one step, but you got to get people together in a bipartisan way in order to solve this country's problems. And I'm committed to that. That's what my whole political life is about. And the good Lord willing, I'll be able to try to continue to do that for Florida and our country.
On a personal note, your birthday, it's your birthday coming up this month. Happy birthday in advance. I know it's coming up. You feel good about where you are in life? Are you feel comfortable about the place? And talk a little bit about Bill Nelson personally.
Well, you know, I was raised to think that public service was one of the highest callings that a person could have. I still feel that way, and I've been so honored representing Florida in the Senate. And there's a lot more to be done. And I can see in the way we passed that Restore Act of going and getting major Republican senators as my co-sponsors on the bill, and then being able to pass it with that overwhelming vote, since it only affected 5 states, the 5 Gulf states, but we got those senators from the rest of the country, Republican and Democrat alike, to support it. That's what I'd like to continue to try to do for our country and for our state.